Hello, I'm glad you've joined me today. Welcome to Nona's Book Nook. Let's read some of Mrs. Piggle Wiggle's magic. Let's read The Thought-you-saiditis Cure. Mr. Burbank absently reached from behind the newspaper for the sugar bowl. His groping fingers hit the toast, the honeycomb, the salt cellar, and finally found the sugar bowl. His children, Darcy, Allison, and Baird, nudged each other and laughed. Every morning, Daddy felt around on the table for the sugar while he read bad news in the newspaper. One morning, the news was so bad and he was so absent, he put currant jelly in his coffee instead of sugar. The children were anxious for a repeat performance and hopefully pushed everything but the sugar in the path of his searching hand. This morning, as soon as Mr. Burbank had found the sugar, he let the paper down with a bang. "The sugar bowl is empty," he said in an aggravated and hurt way. Here's Mr. Burbank looking for the sugar and two of his children laughing at him. Mrs. Burbank, who was buttering toast, said, "Darcy, run out to the kitchen and fill the sugar bowl, dear. The sugar's in the big red can." Darcy obediently got up, took the sugar bowl, and went out to the kitchen. After a long time, he came back to the breakfast table with a plate of cinnamon rolls. "What are these for?" his father said, "and where's the sugar?" "Sugar?" said Darcy. "What about sugar?" "I told you to fill up the sugar bowl," said Mrs. Burbank. "Oh," said Darcy, "I thought you said get the cinnamon roll." All three children looked at each other and laughed loudly. Finally, Mr. and Mrs. Burbank laughed too. Darcy went out and filled the sugar bowl, and Mr. Burbank, after having 3 cups of coffee, missed his bus and decided to walk as far as the school with the children. Just as they were going out the front door, Allison remembered her arithmetic book, and she dashed upstairs to try to find it. In a minute, she leaned over the banister and called, "Mother, did you see my arithmetic book?" Mrs. Burbank said, "What does it look like?" Allison said, "It's blue and not very thick." Mrs. Burbank said, "I think it's on the table in the hall." Allison said, "How did it get out there?" Mrs. Burbank said, "Out where?" "I said it's on the table in the hall." Allison said, "Oh, I thought you said it's out in the stable in a stall." All three children roared with laughter. Allison found her arithmetic book, and they all left the house laughing and repeating, "Out in the stable in a stall." Mr. Burbank said, come on, we haven't all day." He walked briskly along the street, his footsteps ringing loudly and purposefully in the thin autumn air. The children giggled and jostled along behind him, their progress so uneven and so broken with "I thought you said" and laughter that Mr. Burbank reached the corner first. In fact, almost before they had even left the yard. He stopped to wait for them and to survey the city that spread below. He was glad he lived on a hill. He was glad he was alive. And he was glad he had a little boy 9, a little girl 7, and a little boy 6. When the children had caught up with him, he said, "Look, children, see how beautiful the city looks from up here. Watch the fog rise over there." "Where's the dog?" said Bard. "What dog?" said Darcy. "What color are the dog's eyes?" asked Allison. "What on earth are you talking about?" said Mr. Burbank. "I said watch the fog rise over there." "Oh," Bard said. "I thought you said watch the dog's eyes glare." All the children laughed and laughed. Mr. Burbank said, "What nonsense." But it was a beautiful morning, and so he laughed with his lighthearted children. When they were halfway down the next block, the children suddenly stopped, stock still, in front of a pretty white house and yelled in unison, "Marilyn! Marilyn, come on, we'll be late. Mr. Burbank said, that's no way to do. If you want Marilyn, go up to her door, knock, and ask for her. The children looked surprised, but they went obediently up to the door and rang the bell. Marilyn's mother opened the door and said something to the children which seemed to send them into convulsions of mirth and laughter. Doubled over with laughter and holding their sides, they came down the walk to their father. Well, what's so funny? Asked Mr. Burbank. Darcy said, Marilyn's mother said Marilyn fell in the toaster and is burnt up dead. Mr. Burbank said, what did Marilyn's mother really say, and why isn't Marilyn going to school today? Allison said, she said Marilyn fell on her coaster and hurt her head, and Darcy thought she said Marilyn fell on the toaster and is burned up dead. She went into another spasm of laughter. Mr. Burbank didn't laugh. Instead, he bent down and examined Darcy's ears, which were large and pink and soft and quite clean. They should work, said Mr. Burbank, looking at the other children's ears. They all seemed quite normal. The children wanted to know what he was doing. Baird said, what are you doing that for, Daddy? Mr. Burbank said, I'm trying to decide whether I should get you an ear trumpet. Beer crumpet? What's that? Baird said. The other children repeated after him, beer crumpet? Beer crumpet? They all laughed, but Mr. Burbank, who had had enough. He said, come on, I'll supervise a race to school. On your marks, get set, go! When Mr. Burbank reached his office, the very first thing he did was to call Mrs. Burbank. He said, Mary, have our children ever had scarlet fever? She said, now you know they haven't, Bernard. Well, he said, have they ever had ear infections? Oh, my goodness, no, said Mrs. Burbank. They've never had anything. They're the healthiest children in the neighborhood. What's the matter? Mr. Burbank said, plenty. They can't any of them hear well. I told them to look at the fog rise, and they thought I was talking about a dog's eyes. Marilyn's mother said that Marilyn fell off her coaster and hurt her head, and they all thought that Marilyn fell in the toaster and was burned up dead, finished Mrs. Burbank. Bernard, did you ever hear of anyone falling in a toaster? Of course not. There's nothing wrong with our children's ears. It's just that they're going through that awful thought-you-said phase. Well, let's get them out of it, said Mr. Burbank. They sound like dopes. Dog's eyes, indeed. Mrs. Burbank said, don't worry, dear. I'll take care of it. As soon as she finished talking to Mr. Burbank, Mrs. Burbank called Marilyn's mother to find out if Marilyn was okay and if there was anything she could do for her. Marilyn's mother said Marilyn was just fine, but the doctors thought she should be quiet for a day or two. When Mrs. Burbank asked Marilyn's mother if she had ever had any trouble with the thought-you-saids and told about the sugar bowl and the cinnamon rolls and the arithmetic book and out in the stable and the stall and about Marilyn's fall and the toaster and the dog's eyes, Marilyn's mother said, oh, Mrs. Burbank, I'm so glad you called and told me all this. You see, Marilyn has been doing the very same thing all morning long, and I was terribly afraid that the blow on her head must have affected her mind. When I asked her if she wanted crumpets or toast, she said, bumped on the nose. Who? When I asked her if she had painted her head, she thought I said, have I painted the bed yet? Oh, Mrs. Burbank said, I'm going to call Mrs. Teagle and see if Terry and Teresa are thought-you-saids. She is such a good manager that if they've had thought-you-saiditis, she's probably thought of a cure. Marilyn's mother asked Mrs. Burbank to call her back if she got any useful information, and they said goodbye. Then Mrs. Burbank called Mrs. Teagle. She told her all about the thought-you-saiditis and asked if she had had any similar experiences with Terry or Teresa. Mrs. Teagle said, oh, now, Mrs. Burbank, you see, we have always studied correct speech, and we all speak correctly. The children always pronounce all their vowels and all their consonants, and therefore we never have any trouble understanding each other. Perhaps the trouble lies with you and Mr. Burbank. Perhaps you do not speak distinctly. Perhaps the poor little children cannot understand you. I am holding little speech classes every afternoon, and if you and Mr. Burbank are interested, I would be glad to have you attend. I wouldn't care to have the children because I'm afraid they might corrupt my children's perfect speech. Mrs. Burbank thanked Mrs. Teagle for her kind offer and told her that perhaps she was right, that she and Mr. Burbank would try to speak more distinctly, and if things didn't improve within a week, they might join one of her speech classes. Mrs. Teagle said, "Glad to be of help any time, Mrs. Burbank," and hung up. That night, when Mr. Burbank came home, she told him all about the call from Mrs. Teagle, and told him that she thought that from now on they should both try to speak more carefully so that their poor little children could understand them. That night at dinner, Mr. Burbank announced in a very loud voice, "Please pass the butter." The children all exchanged glances and whispers and then laughed, and the butter remained cool and comfortable in its little plate in front of Darcy. Mr. Burbank looked accusingly at Mrs. Burbank. She said in a high and natural voice, "Children, listen to me. Please pass your father the butter." "Oh," said Darcy, "did you say pass the butter? I thought you said fleas, gasp, and mutter." Allison said, "I thought you said he's Pa's mother." Baird said, "I thought you said freeze Pat's brother." Mr. Burbank said in a low, grim voice, "I said, please pass the butter." Darcy passed him the butter with a beaming smile. The next morning after breakfast, Mr. Burbank called from upstairs, "Where's my briefcase? Anybody seen my briefcase?" Allison said, "Who's got a thief's face?" Darcy said, "Beef paste. What do you want with beef paste?" Baird said, "Leaf race? I thought he said leaf race." They all laughed loudly and did not look for his briefcase. They could hear their mother and father banging doors and scuffling around upstairs, but they were so busy thought-you-saiding with each other, they didn't even notice that Baird was standing right in front of Daddy's briefcase, which was leaning against the radiator in the front hall. Finally, Mr. Burbank came running down the stairs, wild-eyed and almost too late for his bus. He called to Mrs. Burbank, "If you find it, dear, bring it right down to the office. I must have it this morning." He slammed the front door and he ran like the wind for his bus. Mrs. Burbank was giving the children their final inspection before school when she saw the briefcase leaning against the wall right behind Baird's fat little legs. She said, "Why, children, why didn't you tell Daddy his briefcase was down here? You must have seen it. Now I'll have to take a special trip all the way down to take it to him. Why didn't you just tell him?" She looked sternly at her three children. Allison said, "Briefcase? Oh, I didn't know that's what he wanted. I thought he said thief's face." Darcy said, "I thought he said beef paste." Baird said, "I thought he said leaf race." Mrs. Burbank said, "You know perfectly well that Daddy wouldn't talk about a thief's face, beef paste, or a leaf race. That's just nonsense, and I'm getting good and tired of this thought-you-saiditis business." She sent them off to school with a little push and not a kiss. But the thought-you-saiditis continued all the rest of that week. By Friday morning, Mr. and Mrs. Burbank were so irritable they didn't even want to come downstairs and eat breakfast with the thought-you-saiders. They tried to solve the problem by not speaking to the children, but of course the telephone rang and Mrs. Burbank said to Allison, "Answer the phone." And Allison didn't move, and her father said, "Answer the phone." And Allison said, "Oh, answer the phone. I thought you said this ham's got a bone." And Darcy said, "I thought you said the dancers are home." And Baird said, "I thought you said, the jam's all alone." It was the last straw. Mr. Burbank said, "This nonsense has got to stop now. I'm not going to eat another meal with the thought-you-saids." As soon as the children had left for school, and even before she washed the breakfast dishes, Mrs. Burbank decided she must do something about the Thought-you-saiders. She poured herself another cup of coffee and sat down at the breakfast table and thought and thought. Old Boy, the dog, came and sat beside her, and she gave him a small piece of ham and stroked his head, and she wondered what to do. She was just going to call Mr. Burbank's mother when the telephone rang again. Mrs. Burbank answered it. It was Mrs. Piggle Wiggle, and she wanted the children to come for tea. Mrs. Burbank said, "Oh, Mrs. Piggle Wiggle, I'm so delighted that you called. I was just sitting here at the breakfast table wondering what in the world to do." And so she told Mrs. Piggle Wiggle about all the Thought-you-saids. Mrs. Piggle Wiggle said, "There's a regular epidemic of Thought-you-saiditis all over town. It really is a very harmless disease, but can be most annoying to parents, especially when they're trying to hurry. I have suffered with it myself this whole week. Put on your shoes is Thought-you-said sat on a fuse. Get me a tack is Thought-you-said butter a cracker, and on and on. Fortunately, the cure is very simple. I have a magic powder which you sprinkle in the children's ears at night. It will make their hearing so keen that they'll be able to hear spiders stamping across the floor, leaves crashing to the ground, flowers petals snapping open, and the fireflies striking matches to light their lanterns. I must warn you that tomorrow when the children are wearing the magic hearing powder, you mustn't pop popcorn, run the vacuum cleaner, or serve dry, crunchy breakfast food. The noise would be too painful to them. I'll send the powder over when the children stop by after school. You might lend a little to Marilyn's mother. Goodbye and good luck." Mrs. Pigwiggle hung up the phone. After school, the children came rushing in to deliver the package for Mrs. Pigwiggle and to change their clothes. Mrs. Pigwiggle's package contained a tiny little box of white powder. Mrs. Burbank felt the powder, smelled it. It felt like talcum powder, and it smelled like ginger. She put it under the pile of clean handkerchiefs in her handkerchief box. That evening, after the children were in bed, she told Mr. Burbank about it. He thought the magic powder sounded wonderful, and you know what? He decided to try some in his own ear. Mrs. Burbank went up and got the little bottle, and Mr. Burbank took a pinch out of his and put it in his left ear. Immediately he shouted, "Turn off that terrible radio! It's killing me!" Mrs. Burbank rushed and turned the radio off. Mr. Burbank said, "It's thundering. We must be going to have a storm." Well, Mrs. Burbank listened. She couldn't hear any thunder. She opened the front door and went out and looked up at the sky. The night was still and quiet as a picture. Mr. Burbank shouted, "The storm's getting louder, almost overhead now." Mrs. Burbank came in, closed the door. She said, "Bernard Burbank, it is a cold, clear, perfectly peaceful night. There is no thunder." Mr. Burbank said, "Listen, don't you hear it? Deafening! That's what it is, deafening!" Mrs. Burbank listened very carefully. Then she heard from the kitchen a very soft, faint, thumping noise. She went out to investigate and found Old Boy, the dog, lying under the kitchen table, scratching and bumping his elbow on the kitchen floor. She gave Old Boy a dog biscuit and put him out, and then she went back into the living room and asked Mr. Burbank if the storm had passed over. He said, "Do you have to stomp your feet like that? You must certainly be getting fat. You sound like a coal truck when you walk." Mrs. Burbank, who was very small, looked down at her soft red house slippers and said, "Bernard, I think you'd better go wash that magic powder out of your ear because I'm going to go out right now and get some graham crackers and think of the torture you'll go through if I drop a crumb." Mr. Burbank said, "Stop shouting." Mrs. Burbank said, "I'm whispering, dear." So Mr. Burbank went upstairs to wash out his ear. When he snapped on the light to the bathroom, he flinched because it sounded like a pistol shot. When he turned on the faucet, it sounded like Niagara Falls, and when he accidentally brushed a hairpin off the windowsill, it sounded like a huge iron chain crashing to the tiled floor. Mr. Burbank filled the bathroom glass with warm water, and he decided that that would be the best way to wash out the magic powder. Just as he was about to pour some in his ear, from behind the bathtub, he heard the most awful screaming, screeching, whining noise. He straightened up, put down the glass, and peered over the bathtub. He didn't see anything. He bent down over the basin again, picked up the glass. He was just about to pour the warm water in his ear when another horrible screaming, squealing came again. This time right by his head. Mr. Burbank was so scared he dropped the glass, spilled the water, and banged his head on the faucet. He looked all around, but he couldn't see anything. The noise came again, this time a little fainter, from behind the Venetian blind. He raised the blind and looked carefully, couldn't see a thing. The terrible noise came again, this time by the mirror. Then Mr. Burbank saw what it was. A big mosquito. He grabbed a washcloth and without thinking of his magic hearing, swatted the mosquito. The screams of agony that immediately filled the bathroom were horrible. Mr. Burbank hurriedly turned on the water faucet and stuck his ear right underneath the water. Whew! What a relief! He picked the dead mosquito up with one leg and put it in the wastebasket, and then he called to Mrs. Burbank. Hey, Mary, I'm all right now, but I think we better go easy with that magic powder in the kids' ears. It's awfully strong. Mrs. Burbank said, perhaps you used too much. Here, I'll measure it out. I'll use a toothpick, and I'll put just a grain or so in the right ear of each child. Come on now, help me. There they are. Measured out the magic powder with a toothpick. Wow, it must be really powerful. They tiptoed in the children's rooms and put a toothpick full of magic powder in each one's ears. Even in his sleep, Darcy was saying, Miss Anderson, I didn't hear you say, hand me that ruler. I thought you said bananas are cooler. Mr. and Mrs. Burbank looked at their sleeping son and then at each other. Just wait until tomorrow, Darcy, old boy, said Mr. Burbank. The next morning at 7 o'clock, Baird came running into his parents' room and said, Mother, Daddy, there is a terrible noise in our room. It sounds like sawing. Mr. and Mrs. Burbank got out of bed, put on their robes, and went to investigate. They couldn't hear a thing. Darcy said, Isn't that an awful noise, Daddy? Do you think it's a buzz bomb? Mr. and Mrs. Burbank looked, and they looked, but they didn't find anything, and they couldn't hear anything. Mr. Burbank told the children to get dressed and come on down to breakfast. Baird began to cry. He said, Well, we'll come down, Daddy, but you don't have to yell at us. Mr. Burbank said in a very quiet voice, Your hearing must be very good this morning. I didn't yell. In fact, I'm almost whispering. Then he said, Exactly where is this buzzing noise coming from, Darcy? Listen carefully and tell me. Darcy said, Right there by the curtain. Mr. Burbank pulled back the curtain and found a very small fly buzzing and buzzing in a corner of the window. Remembering his experience with the mosquito, he unlatched the screen and pushed the fly off the windowsill, and it flew happily away. Darcy said, Daddy, I can't stand this awful crunching noise my shoelaces make when I push them through the holes. It sounds like bones breaking. Mr. Burbank said, Here, I have an idea, and he tied his handkerchief around Darcy's head like a bandage. This'll fix it, he said softly. Whistle Biscuit. Darcy said, I thought you said Whistle Biscuit. His father jerked the handkerchief off and said, Hurry down to breakfast. At breakfast, Allison said, Oh, Mother, I can't stand the sound of you buttering that toast. It sounds like hoeing on cement. Baird said, Hoeing on cement? I thought you said, He took a spoonful of oatmeal and never finished the sentence. A piece of toast popped out of the toaster. All three children jumped. Darcy said, Mother, you should warn us when you're going to make so much noise. Mrs. Burbank said, I'm sorry, but it didn't seem loud to me. I guess my ears aren't very good. Allison said, Come on, boys, let's go to school. Darcy said, I thought thought you said poison. I thought you said poison. I mean, oh, I don't know what I meant. Allison said, old boy's breathing so loud, I can't hear a thing. And does he have to slosh his tongue around in his mouth like that, Mother? Oh, Mrs. Burbank called old boy and gave him a piece of bacon. He snapped and gulped, and all three children jumped and shuddered. Mrs. Burbank said, come, children, put on your coats and go to school. Allison said, spit on your coats? I thought you said spit on your coats. Nobody laughed. Darcy said, don't talk so loud, Allison. It hurts my ears. Baird said, didn't you hear what Mother said? She didn't say spit on your coats. She said put on your coats. Allison said, I know it. I can hear. Let's go. The front door closed quietly, and Mrs. Burbank said to her husband, who was groping for the sugar, that's the first time in 5 years they haven't banged the front door closed. Here's the sugar, dear, and you have 4 minutes before your next bus. Just then the front door opened and the three children came crying into the house. Allison said, Mother, we just can't stand it. The sidewalk is covered with leaves, and when we walk through them, it sounds so dreadful we just can't bear it. It sounds like hundreds of giants chopping wood. Baird said, it sounds like 1,000,000 paper bags. Darcy said, it sounds like thousands of houses burning up. Crackle, crackle, crash. Mrs. Burbank said, well, Bernard, I think we'd better wash out their ears, and we'll give Mrs. Piggle Wiggle our heartiest thanks. Mr. Burbank said, what's she done wrong? Who? Said Mrs. Burbank. Mrs. Piggle Wiggle, said Mr. Burbank. What are you talking about? Said Mrs. Burbank. I said we should give Mrs. Piggle Wiggle our heartiest thanks. Oh, said Mr. Burbank. I thought you said, go give Mrs. Piggle Wiggle your hardest spanks. The children didn't laugh. The end. Wow, Mrs. Piggle Wiggle sure fixed that thought-you-saiditis, didn't she? Little bit of magic powder and they could hear everything. Thank you for joining me. Come again and we'll read some more next time. Goodbye.